Welcome to the Betterment Lectures. My name is Dr. Doreen Miners, and if there is one thing I've learned as a brain scientist, it is that there is no instruction manual for this device in our heads. But there are patterns. There are patterns of thought, patterns of feeling, of action, because that's the brain's job. It has to create the patterns that gracefully handle the predictable shapes of everyday life. Now, we call these things ideologies, rituals or biases. But there is something else I've learned teaching this stuff, and that's that we are animals first. You can't escape these patterns, but you can choose which ones to emphasize. So let me teach you about them. One pattern, one podcast. That's the basic idea, and you choose if it works for you. Now, I've already done a longer intro than I plan to ordinarily do because I hate long podcast intros. But since this is the first podcast, I may as well talk a little bit about this, the vision I have for this podcast of mine. So I write a lot at Betterment, my website, btr.mt, but people don't always have the time to read the articles, and frankly, they complain about it. Plus, since I started as an associate professor in the behavioural science department here at RMA Sandhurst, I find that I'm essentially lecturing on the very same stuff. So I thought, why not take all the good stuff that I'm already teaching here in verbal format and share it here. But since I don't have a lot of time, I've got to be pretty strategic about this. So what I plan to do, I'm going to take one idea that I teach, see if I can turn it into a podcast in 2 or 3 hours after class is done, and we'll see how things, how they develop. Now, because this is the first podcast, I got to choose something that really bites, that hooks you. So I want to choose something that's been pretty popular. And I started talking about this idea when I started doing leadership consulting. There were some executives that had a problem with it, but it was so useful. It's become sort of a mainstay in my arsenal, in consulting, in talking to people, in the keynotes that I deliver, in some of the one-on-one stuff I do. But in particular, the students seem to really like it when I slip it in here. In fact, come to think of it, it might actually be one of the bits that I used in the taster lecture I delivered to get this job in the first place. So I'll share it with you. And now, I mean, it occurs to me that since I've mentioned my workplace, Sandhurst, the opinions expressed here are obviously my own opinions. They don't reflect Sandhurst or the British military or the United Kingdom more broadly. It's just Dorian doing his little podcast. But the idea is that stress is a good thing. So let's get into it. All right, so I want to start off with this article from The Atlantic that I love. It is like the quintessential example of the kind of thing I have in mind. So this article, I'll put a link in the show notes, but it was written by a management professor, I believe. And I just want to quote a little tiny bit of it. So he says, in other words, stress makes you fight, flee, or freeze, not think. What would a prudent reaction be at this moment? This makes great evolutionary sense. 500,000 years ago, taking the time to manage your emotions would have made you a tiger's lunch. But in the modern world, even if you don't have tigers to outrun, you can't relax in your cave because the emails are piling up. And this is it. This is the expression of what stress is that I'm specifically targeting today. This idea that it was evolved thousands of years ago, millions of years ago to outrun lions on the savannah, or whatever the case may be. But now it's just triggered by all these non-lethal, mundane problems that we face in day-to-day life. Stress is this thing that's poorly calibrated to the modern world. And it gets in the way, right? It hinders our performance. It stops us behaving how we want to behave. It gets in the way in our relationships. It's a bad thing, right? That's fundamentally the idea. And I want to counter that because I think that not only is stress typically calibrated perfectly for the modern world, it's also the only thing that gets us to perform at all. At whatever it is, at work, in relationships, whatever, stress is the thing that gets the job done. And in that sense, I think it's actually the most valuable biological technology that we have. So we got to start with a basic background. I think what's happening here, this is some kind of misunderstanding of Robert Sapolsky's work, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Again, I'll link that book in the show notes if you haven't come across it. But it is sort of the core premise, although it's a misunderstanding of it that's sort of wrapped up with work that's been done in the trauma community. So in the discipline of trauma research and trauma practice, working with people with trauma, these two ideas have sort of gone smushed together. I don't think we need to get into the detail of that too much, but I think what's good to know is that, this idea of fight, flight, or freeze really originated to describe hypervigilance, a life or death response to a threat. So this is the kind of thing that kicks in when you almost get hit by a car, a near miss of that kind. And most people are not responding to email notifications with fight or flight. People with a lot of trauma, like for example, people with PTSD, often respond to mundane stuff with fight or flight. But people who do not suffer that kind of thing typically respond to these things absolutely normally. So if you're responding to email notifications with fight, flight, or freeze responses, then there's something wrong and you shouldn't just be putting up with it. Rather than adopt this model, I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about the Yerkes-Dodson Law. Now, the Yerkes-Dodson Law is a really old model of stress. It's it's over 100 years old, maybe 1915, 1917, something like that. A lot of people will be introduced to this through a first year or a high school psychology course. But it's really, really simple. Even though it's old, even though it's simple, it's still contiguous with what we know today about the human stress response. I want you to picture a graph, an x-axis, a righty-lefty bit, and a y-axis, an uppy-downy bit, and plot on it like a bell curve, right? Like a little mountain or a hill, an inverted U if you like, and put yourself down the bottom left corner of your little hill. And what we're looking at is that as stress is low, performance is low. As arousal in the body is low, performance is low. You're not going to do anything when you're not stressed, when you're not aroused. And as stress goes up, performance increases, right? So you're moving up the hill now because stress is recruiting interest and attention and all the cognitive and physical resources that you need to get the task at hand done. And as you keep going up your hill, right, as stress keeps going up, performance keeps going up until you reach the peak. And at this point, you're talking about optimal stress and optimal performance. If you've heard of a flow state, this is kind of the thing that we're talking about here. It's where you're completely absorbed by the task at hand, where your capacity to do something is completely met by the challenge that you're facing. So this is the kind of time where you would find yourself sitting down, doing the thing, and 3 hours flies by and you look up and you've missed lunch. In fact, rather, the same exact thing happened as I was trying to set up for this first podcast. You just lose track of time. You're completely occupied by what you're doing. You have no room for anything else. The peak of the stress curve, optimal stress, optimal performance. Now, if you continue to get stressed, you're going to start falling down the other side of our little hill. You're going to start becoming more stressed, but your performance is going to decline. You know this, right? You've been injected with this much stress before. You get the jitters when you're this stressed. You get some brain fog. You start to stammer, study your words. You're just not thinking as clearly when you have too much stress in the system. And most people, when they're talking about stress, they're talking about something like this. They're talking about the right-hand side of our stress curve, right? When people are falling down the wrong side of our hill. But there's so much to be gained by understanding the left side of the curve, right? That gentle uphill to optimal stress, optimal performance, the peak of stress and performance. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. But before we move on, let me just put it into perspective for you. And I think that this will convince you that the Yerkes-Dodson Law is the right way to think about stress. So let's imagine that you have a project due. Let's say you have an assignment due if you're in school, or if you're at work, it's a presentation. Maybe it's just something for your kids, right? Something that you got to get done for the PTA meeting. And you know that if you devote your spare time to it, it's going to take you about a week to get this project done. Now, let's say that the due date for this thing is next year, 12 months from now. Where are you on our little stress curve? If you're looking at your little stress hill, where are you positioned? I would suggest that you're down the bottom, right? Low stress, low performance. You are just not motivated to do this project unless you are a particularly disciplined kind of person or you're super bored, right? There's just not any motivation to do it. It's due in 12 months. Why would you use what spare time you have getting it done? No stress, no performance. But if we move that due date up, let's say it's due next month or something, then you are all of a sudden going to be much more motivated to get that task done. Again, if you're a particularly disciplined person, honestly, not me, I like to leave things to the last minute. But if that due date is closer, then there's a little bit more stress in the system and you are much more likely to be paying attention to that task, to thinking about what needs to be done, to collecting the resources that are going to get it done, this sort of thing. Now let's imagine that the due date is next week and it's going to take you a week. Now we've moved all the way up to the top of the hill. We are going to spend all our spare time doing this project. We know that we just don't have enough time to do anything else. Optimal stress, optimal performance. We could not be spending more time on this project than we can right now. And then, of course, you can start to slide down the hill. The due date is in 3 days or it's due tomorrow and it's going to take you a week. Now there's too much stress. You're starting to panic. You got all this sick feeling in your stomach. You're getting the jitters. You've got brain fog. You're just not doing as good a job as you would if you hadn't have left it until it was too late. And I'm pretty sure that you're all familiar with that feeling. And this is the stress curve, right? It's really a straightforward way to describe stress. But look, there's a couple of things that are interesting to talk about here, I think, beyond just the basic curve, right? Beyond low stress, low performance, optimal stress, optimal performance, high stress, poor performance. There's also a couple of little quirks. So one of the quirks is that, for simple tasks, this doesn't really obtain. You don't really get this effect. So if the task is, this is often done on animal models of behavior. So, I'm going to really have to simplify the task. Let's say, somebody's holding a gun to your head and saying, look at this red button. Just look at this red button. Don't look anywhere else. That's a super stressful situation, but you're not going to have much trouble looking at the button, right? It's a simple task. And even if you have maximum stress in your body, you are really not going to have difficulty looking away. So if the task is super simple, then you see this thing where there's low stress, higher performance, high stress or optimal performance, and then it plateaus at that point. So this is more for complex tasks for a start. And then there's, maybe performance is a bit of a misnomer because there's certain kinds of things that this is less good for. So down the bottom of our hill, low stress, low performance, this is the sort of area where we are optimizing for something else. So again, returning to animal models of behavior, here you're talking about cognitive flexibility, low stress, low performance, cognitive flexibility, reward-seeking behavior, exploration behavior, creativity, essentially. If what you're seeking is creativity, then you want low stress. And you know this. If your project's due in a month or 2 months and it's going to take you a week, you're thinking not really about getting the project done as fast as possible. You're thinking of all the ways it could be done, right? Maybe you can pick a different theme for whatever it is that you're presenting, different color scheme, different fonts, or maybe you can incorporate this avant-garde thing into it that you wouldn't otherwise consider because you have the time for that. Low stress, it's not precisely performance, but it's creativity. It's a different kind of thing. And as you go up the hill, as stress increases, one of the reasons that you get better performance is because it promotes cognitive rigidity. So you're engaging in more stereotypical thinking and behaving. You're doing things how things should be done, not thinking about how they could be done, right? If it's due in a week, your project, then you're not thinking of changing the fonts. You're just doing the project as you know it needs to be done to get it over the line. So that's one of the benefits and the drawbacks. This cognitive rigidity is the thing that helps you achieve performance. But if you want creativity, you don't really want to be injecting too much stress into the system. And then so far we've been talking about this biological mechanism, right? We're mapping the biological response to stress. But there's also a psychological dimension to it. And I'm going to talk about a particular cut on this by an endocrinologist by the name of Hans Sale. So he's writing about this in the 1970s. It's an old model, and there are newer models that can give you better fidelity on the problem, give you more insights into the kind of thing I'm talking about. But for the purpose of this little lecture here, I'm going to talk about Hans Sale's model of eustress. So again, I'll put links to all this stuff in the show notes, but eustress is good stress. It's the left side of the stress curve. It's the low stress, low performance, a little bit more stress, high performance, all the way up to optimal stress, optimal performance, that side of our hill. Eustress, good stress, is posed in contrast to distress. And this is the right-hand side of our curve, right? Once you go over the peak, over the hill, down the other side, now you're in distress. And he said that the fundamental difference here seemed to be something about how controllable the stressor felt to us. So it's the difference between a threat and a challenge. Eustress, good stress, challenges are things that are controllable. It's something that we have enough resources for. We have the capacity to do it. We have the time. We have the people to be able to accomplish whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. We have the resources for it. And as a consequence, we're much more oriented towards the possibility of success or reward as a consequence of what we're doing. In contrast, threats, bad stress, distress, the other side of the hill, this is characterized by uncontrollability. So you're badly resourced, you don't have the capacity to do the task, or you don't have the time, you don't have the people, you don't have the material. And as a consequence, you are focused much more on the possibility of failure or damage as a result of what it is that you're doing. So this is a psychological dimension. And again, I can give you an example of this. So, I don't know if a project is a good example, but let's say that your project is public speaking, right? And you've gotten to the day and you're standing up in front of everybody and you're presenting your group presentation or to the PTA meeting or at work, and you have a mental blank. You completely forget what it is you've meant to say. This is often a physiological thing, right? There's so much adrenaline in your body that it's just blotted out your cognitive thoughts. And now you're in distress, right? I'm embarrassing myself. I'm not doing a good job. I'm going to show myself up. I'm not going to be picked to do this again. You're on the wrong side of the curve. You're falling down that hill. But then you remember, hey, I have notes for this. Why don't I just pull them out? So you pull out your little palm cards from your pocket and you look and you remember where you're up to. It all comes back to you and you're lurching back, straight back into your performance, right back where you left off. And you might still be a little jittery because there's that physiological effect. But even though there's all this stress in the body from that experience, you're still performing now. You've moved much closer to eustress, to good stress, rather than distress. So it's not just a biological thing. We're not just talking about the sympathetic response and the parasympathetic response. We're talking also about this psychological distress, this difference between something that is controllable versus uncontrollable. And then the last couple of points that I want to point out are some caveats, because people always want to take away a message from this, which is that, I say stress is good, so we should just stress people all of the time. And that is also not true. I mean, stress is itself a costly resource. So to use stress is to use up something in our bodies. And the best model for this is something called allostatic load. And I'll link, you can just look on Wikipedia page, but I will link to the Wikipedia page in the show notes. But allostatic load basically refers to, I suppose, wear and tear on the body is how it's described. So it's the wear on the cognitive and biological systems that comes with stress, because stress is a costly resource, both in cognitive terms and in biological terms. So if you're going to use stress all the time, if you're stressed all the time at a high level, you're actually damaging your body and your mind. It's going to lead to increasingly poor cognitive and biological outcomes. And this, it's terrible, the stuff that it does to you. You should just look at, again, the Wikipedia page on chronic stress will give you a litany of all the terrible things that this can do to you. So we don't want to be using stress all the time. And if you imagine our hill, what being stressed all the time does is it squishes it, right? You put your hand on the top of the hill and you push it over towards the left, towards the good side of stress, right? So you're not going to perform as well if you're stressed to that optimal level. The more stressed you are over time, right? Your capacity for performance reduces. And the opportunity for good stress reduces, right? That side of the hill becomes steeper and shorter, harder to climb. You're going to spend much less time good stressed, and you're going to spend much more time possibly in this bad stress. There's much more space for being overstressed if you're engaging in stress all the time. So that's one thing. Stress is a costly resource. And then the very final thing is that, one stress curve doesn't characterize all things for all people. Things that you're good at have a different stress curve than things that you're bad at, right? Again, resurrect our hill, bring it back up to its former glory. And things you're good at, if you smush it down and to the right, it makes good stress last longer. Your opportunity for good stress increases. And the likelihood that you fall over that peak and fall into bad stress decreases. Equally, for stuff that you're bad at, it's the inverse. The chances that you're going to be good stress, eustressed about it, is not as high as the chances that you're going to be distressed, badly stressed in response to whatever it is. So different tasks for the same person have different stress curves, but also different people have different stress curves. So what stresses me might not produce the same stress curve for you, and what stresses you might not produce the same stress curve for me. And that's it. That's the Yerkes-Dodson Law. And look, it's a simple model, right? You're just picturing a hill or a bell shape or something like this. But look how much we drew out of it. And we didn't have to recourse to sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous systems. We didn't have to talk about amygdalas, fight, flight, or freeze. It's just a simple model. It gives you simple answers to simple questions. And I think it's a good one. So look, I'll leave it there and come back with a little outro because I got to get out of here. So I'll do a little wrap up and then I'll let you go. All right, so the first thing is that good stress and bad stress, eustress and distress, performing and being too stressed to perform, this is a continuum. It's the same physical mechanisms that's driving both of those things. You can't talk about stress as a negative thing without also realizing that that is the same mechanism involved in you doing anything at all. Stress is, in many ways, the same thing as motivation, or it's an important ingredient in motivation. But of course, that's not always true. Low stress is better for creativity, right? You want to be down the bottom of that stress curve if you are looking to be cognitively flexible, if you want to engage in exploration behaviors, if you want to be engaging in reward-seeking behaviors, then low stress is much better for that. More stress, one of the reasons that it produces performance is because of cognitive rigidity. It imbues you with this sort of stereotypicality. You're going to do things the way they should be done. And that implies that you're only really going to be able to utilize that properly if you can actually do the thing, if you've been trained to do the thing, right? You need cognitive rigidity in the right direction. So stress goes hand in hand with training and learning how to do the thing. And then the last point to draw out of the stress curve is that it's not just a biological phenomenon, it's also psychological, right? There's a difference between a challenge and a threat, and that's the controllability of the thing. So how much physical stress you have in your body is going to influence whether you perceive something as controllable or uncontrollable, but you have a little bit of wiggle room there in that psychological aspect, trying to change a threat into a challenge by trying to think differently about the resources that you have and make it controllable. And then the caveats. So you don't want to just stress people all the time, or you're going to wear them out, you're going to burn them out. In fact, what you want is tactical deployment of stress. You want stress just injected at the times where you want to perform a little better, knowing that the trade-off is that allostatic load. And so that means that we've got to be thoughtful about it. We should be a little bit concerned about stress, not fight, flight, or freeze stress for the average person, but we don't want to be just stressing ourselves all the time, because that leads to chronic stress. And then the last thing is that individual curves are super important. So different tasks, different challenges are going to have different curves for you, and different people are going to have different curves for you. And that's it. That's the Yerkes-Dodson Law. That's the first Betterment lecture. I'd be very keen to hear any feedback as to how this went, how the format was, how you found the amount of content, the length, that sort of stuff. And I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to run. Until next time.